All right, so this video is about rights in business. And so it's from Gibson's chapter, and he opens up with a very kind of interesting story about the La Clemenceau, which is a ship that was taken to this shipyard in India. And this shipyard was what they call a graveyard for big kind of ocean liners, freight ships, and that kind of thing, and they would break them apart. And at the shipyard, they would break them apart by hand. So it was a very kind of tedious, very kind of labor-intensive, very kind of raw, brutal type of activity. It required much grit, much force, a lot of power, a lot of heavy lifting, and also a lot of danger. Danger just in terms of the jobs. You have big metal ships that you're breaking apart, and the workers were given kind of very little in terms of guidance, in terms of training, and in terms of safety equipment. So eventually, essentially they're just kind of blowtorching these things apart, ripping them apart by hand, sledgehammer, that kind of thing. These ships oftentimes were very much filled with chemicals, and so there was no protection in that regard. The workers were paid very little, at least by Western standards, about $2 a day, I believe it was, and they would perform very long hours. And so Greenpeace got involved. Greenpeace, which is a human rights organization, and they said, this is unfair, this is bad, you're mistreating workers, and you need to stop. And those efforts eventually led to improvements in safety, improvements in terms of pay, but also led to a massive decrease in the number of ships that came to the yard. And so it also led to a massive decrease in people that were employed. So many people got laid off. And you're talking about a part of India which is dirt poor. You're talking about people that are surviving barely in terms of a monetary sense. And so the reaction was very much mixed. There's some people that were happy the standards got better, but a lot of people were very upset that the jobs went away, and they essentially went to other shipyards that didn't have the same kind of standards and safety protocols. And so it's interesting to think now, well, what would our theorists say? Well, one branch, certainly the kind of Machiavelli would just say, whatever makes the most amount of profit. So if this loses profit, essentially that they should mistreat the workers, and the workers should be able to kind of do what they want. From a free market perspective, though, it's interesting because free market, and we think about Milton Friedman here, is not simply that you can buy what you want. It also means that you can be employed where you want, or at least you can seek employment where you wish. And if you want to work at some place that meets your needs, that pays you the amount that you feel is fit, then go for it. If you don't want to work there, don't work there. And so the free market approach would essentially say that the laborer, the employee, should have as much freedom as possible in terms of determining where they want to work. And if they are satisfied with these safety conditions, if they're satisfied with the pay, if they're satisfied with the training, then more or less so be it. There's also, and this would be much more closer to a Catholic point of view, sort of a universal human rights endorser. And here, the universal human rights person would say, look, there are certain practices, there are certain activities, there are certain standards that should be met no matter what, even if the employee is willing to forego those standards, even if the employee is willing to put him or herself in danger. That there should be just certain basic rights that any employee, regardless of education, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of their place in the world, ought to be able to enjoy. And so here, these people would say, look, it's not simply up to the employee. Rather, there are certain standards that should be met, and that's it. And in this case, these universal human rights employees, or defenders, would be much closer to the Greenpeace people. They would say, if you do not improve these standards, then you should be shut down. And so the question for you guys would be, what do you agree with? Do you agree more with the kind of the freedom perspective, the libertarian free market perspective, which says, minimal standards are okay as long as there's employees willing to work them? Or do you side more with the human rights defenders, which would say, no, there are certain basic standards that should be met? And I guess you can kind of debate a little bit about how great those standards have to be, or vice versa, how minimal they could be. The book also talks about this idea of consumer rights. Do consumers have a right to a safe product? And many people would certainly say yes, but then again, you go into tension with freedom. Should consumers be able to purchase a product that maybe isn't safe because they really want it? You know, cigarettes are kind of a classic example, but you can go even further. You go with hardcore drugs. You go with people that jump out of planes in these kind of suits, the squirrel flying suits, where they get very close to the ground and they risk death every time they do it. Should they be able to do that? You know, it's a certain kind of, it's a basic issue. And it's an interesting issue, and Gibson brings this up in terms of what level of risk are you expecting? If you buy something from the black market, for example, if you buy drugs off the black market, you know you're taking more of a risk than if you buy a drug at a pharmacy. The same thing if you engaged in prostitution. You know you are taking a greater risk in terms of getting a disease than if you were with somebody that was not a prostitute. So you have these kind of the black markets that operate illegally, and there, by entering that black market, by purchasing something from it, you know there's going to be a greater risk. But in the regular market, should we assume any risk? Should we assume that we're completely protected? Maybe, but what cost does that also carry with it? What cost does it add on to a product to make that product completely safe, to regulate that product, to inspect that product? And is that worth it? Or should we let the free market decide what people are willing to risk or not? Now, in the same vein, you're assigned this week, or will watch in class if this is an in-person class, a video about a very famous and gruesome abortion doctor, Kermit Gosnell, who was sentenced a few years ago. He was a Philadelphia doctor, and he performed these abortions in North Philly. And the video documentary, 3801 Lancaster Avenue, details his practice. And so here you have people that are going in, young women that are going in, and they want an abortion. You know, oftentimes this is a very late-term abortion, second, third trimester, and they're poor, they don't have a lot of money, and the video talks about the terrible conditions the clinic practiced in. You know, it was unsanitary. There was blood on the wall. It was filled with trash. There were remains of the fetus around the office in terms of jars and things like that. And so it was disgusting in that sense. It was also kind of a low information environment. These women kind of talked about how they didn't get much information. They didn't meet with Gosnell until he's actually in the room performing the abortion. One woman, you know, complained that, look, the receptionist or the person that was assigned to her told her, you know, women in Brazil have 10, 12, 18, 20 abortions, and so it's fine to have an abortion. It doesn't hurt your body. And she later kind of breaks down and says, you know, I can't believe that. I can't believe I fell for that. I can't believe I believed that, because she's unable to have kids now. And then finally, there are the charges that Gosnell was convicted on, where he literally had the baby birthed alive, came out of the womb, and then they would take scissors on occasion and literally cut the spinal cord of this infant baby. And, you know, obviously shocking, gruesome, and horrific. And so, you know, in that case, you could have a rights violation, certainly, of the baby, and that's what he was brought up on. But it raises the question. You know, again, if we're going to kind of take rights versus free market to this extreme, at what point do you say, if you're a free market defender, that these women have the right to get this procedure done? I mean, do people have a right to go to a low information, dirty, high risk doctor in order to get a procedure done that they want? You know, and with that high risk, that low information, that dirtiness, probably comes a cheaper price, and also a willingness by the doctor to kind of perform abortions that others might not. So what the woman gets out of it, that goes to this, is they get a cheaper abortion, most likely, and they get to have an abortion, maybe when they wouldn't have in other places. So that's what they get. But they also sacrifice quite a bit. And so the question becomes, should, in general, we say that's okay, that's their choice? Or should we say, no matter what, a doctor like this has an obligation to give as much information as possible, to respect the right of a patient, for example, to pull out of a procedure, to keep the office clean? And there's also, as the video mentions, a kind of a racial dimension in this. And so that, again, is a question for you to think about. At what level should there be rights, if any level, and how great should those rights be? Okay, moving forward, Gibson talks about the difference between positive and negative rights. Positive rights are essentially those rights where I have to do something, or society has to do something to help ensure them. So if, for example, we say you have a right to an education, that means society has to set up a system whereby people are educated. You can't have education, you can't have this right if society isn't structured to promote it and make sure it happens. Same thing with something like clean water. If you believe that people have a right to clean water, then you got to make sure that there's systems in place, sanitation centers, regulators that monitor the water to make sure that that in fact happens. But there's other negative rights. So negative rights are where essentially you do what you want and you're not interfered with. So it's negative in the sense that there's nothing that is preventing you from doing it. So for example, free speech or your free practice of religion. It's a negative right in the sense that society doesn't so much have to do anything, but society should reserve a space for you to do what you want. And so in that case, you can think about, well, what is more important, or how do these rights coexist? How do we promote them? So on and so forth. Okay, I want to then get to this other case study that Gibson talks about, and this is the Niger Delta case, where we have Shell Oil in Nigeria, and so they are producing a lot of oil out of this region. And the question becomes, does Shell have an obligation to the people of that region? Do they have an obligation to hire people from that region? Do they have an obligation to promote the well-being of people in that region? For example, if Shell says, for instance, as they did, that the people in that region are not qualified enough to work at the plant, that they're not educated enough, would Shell have an obligation to set up schools to promote education, to promote learning, to eventually get to the point where the people of that region can be employed by Shell? There's also this question of the government. And so there are protesters against Shell, saying what they're doing is kind of stealing from the land, they're being unjust to the people of that region. And the Nigerian government cracked down on the protesters. And in that case, what obligation does Shell have to dissuade the government, to kind of combat the government, to say, look, that's not right? Or are they just taking advantage of legitimate protection? And what makes it interesting is that in a lot of cases, certainly in the U.S., many times the government is going to be more powerful than the individual business. But in the case of smaller countries, when they're coming, and there's an international kind of corporation, oftentimes the international corporation has as much money as the government. Sometimes they have more. So in that case, the corporation can oftentimes exercise a massive amount of influence over that government if they so choose. And so in a case where an international global corporation goes into a small, poor country that maybe is very poorly educated, a country rife with corruption, for example, you can ask yourself, well, what obligation does the company have to ensure, or to at least promote rights amongst the people? Do they have an obligation to kind of really pressure the government to clean up its act? To make sure, for example, that women can speak, or that minorities can speak, or that one religious group isn't tortured and killed by another? And that goes above and beyond, the obligation that the company may have to the people of that region. If they go to that region because the salaries are cheaper, and oftentimes that's the case, do they have an obligation to pay just whatever the minimum wage of that country is? Do they have an obligation to pay more than the minimum wage of that country, so as to kind of raise the standards of the people that are working there? Or not? Or do they just purely have an obligation to go in, run the business as efficiently and effectively as possible and make as much money as possible. And we're going to end here. And Gibson talks about this. It's the idea of rights and who could protect rights. So if you think that there are certain basic rights that should be upheld and should be defended, that it shouldn't be all just kind of free choice, and or it shouldn't be all just kind of no holds bar and do what you want. If you think there are certain rights that ought to be protected, and maybe you think there's more than just minimal rights, maybe you think there's a great degree of rights, a great amount of rights that should be protected, then who is going to protect those rights? And Gibson, at the end of his chapter, mentions 4 candidates. 1 is government, 2 are companies, 3 are NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, and 4 are consumers. It's interesting to think about, well, who is the best promoter and protector of rights? Or could these different organizations and these different groups work together? So governments have the rule of law. Governments also often have the rule of police and military. So governments are one of those few entities in the world that can actually force you to do something against your will. And in that case, they could also ensure, or at least try to ensure, that people are able to exercise basic rights. And so if a company is abusing you, the government would have the ability, the power, to come in and arrest the people that run that business, would come in and have the right to, open up the gates of that business, if, for example, if they were being discriminatory and not allowing a certain group to enter and to participate. And so, by virtue of pure physical force, police and military, or by virtue of law and court and penalties, government does have the ability, great ability, to influence behavior and to protect rights. Companies themselves have an ability to protect rights. Certainly, they can set standards that would ensure everyone gets a fair shake, and everyone gets, for example, a fair wage. And in this case, if you go back to the Shell example, perhaps a company has an obligation, certainly maybe a rich multinational corporation has an obligation to kind of ensure that rights are protected, even if it is not the practice in the country of which they're a part. NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Oftentimes they don't have a great deal of pure power, physical power. For example, and this would be like Doctors Without Borders, Red Cross, Salvation Army, those kind of organizations that seek to do good. So they may not have the ability to kind of force you to do anything. But what is interesting about NGOs is they oftentimes have a great deal of local knowledge. They understand the particular situation. They understand the people involved. They understand who is abusing or who is protecting rights, and who can be influenced, and so on and so forth. They understand if you're going to actually solve the problem with force, here's how to use it. And so NGOs can have a great degree of influence in that way. And then finally, there are the consumers. Now, consumers can't force somebody or force the company to do something. They don't have the power of the police. They don't have the power of the military. They're individuals, a collection of individuals. But they also have a great deal of power and a great ability to promote rights purely through their purchasing behavior. If there is a company that is discriminatory, if there is a company that is abusing its workers, then consumers can simply stop purchasing from that company. They can change their purchasing behaviors. And that change can bring down companies. So consumers very clearly can signal what behavior they view as objectionable. And if a company is exhibiting objectionable behavior, not promoting rights, not protecting rights, then if consumers simply change their behavior, you will not be surprised at how quickly that company changes its practices. Just look at something like Wells Fargo very recently, where the bank was cheating customers, essentially adding accounts that the customers didn't want. That got out. There was consumer outrage, and Wells Fargo has completely changed its incentive structure, how it pays its employees, how it judges its employees. And so consumers have an incredible amount of power when it comes to enforcing or promoting rights if they want to, and if consumers act generally as a collective. And so there is a discussion of rights. It's a very interesting chapter, a very important chapter. And I look forward to hearing from you and thinking through these ideas with you.